Welcome into the Husker247 Podcast. I'm Michael Bruntz. That's Brian Christopherson. Brian, the sun is shining. The temperatures are over. We're in double digits this morning. I might take my shirt off during the podcast here if the moment strikes me. Are you staying warm? And also, how are you going to spend the all of a sudden blast of tropical air here?
Yeah, this is how we're gonna know if the guys who came from Miami, like if they're when they're fitting into the culture. It's when you see them. I saw your joke the other day, and it's true about hoodie and shorts weather. How we're coming upon that with this heat wave. That's when you'll know the Miami guys or any of the guys who are from southern states have adapted well to their new surroundings when they feel like a 19-degree day is like balmy, like it just feels good to them. They might put the car windows down a bit. That's when things are really going well and tells you not only do you have a good culture, but you got guys that they've adapted and they're thriving in it, and so that's going to be important to watch.
They got to watch out for those guys, though. Did you see the clip going around of Ja'Cory Barney? He hit a patch of ice outside Memorial Stadium. I believe it was Ja'Cory Barney. Hit a patch of ice outside of Memorial Stadium and did like the full on, like on his back, like to the ground type fall. So they're still adapting, I guess. I suppose there's a little bit of an adjustment period to that.
You need like someone in the program whose only job, like kind of an advisor role, is to like teach those guys like even how to walk into the stadium, like when there's like ice patches, and beware that, like short choppy steps, like you kind of go through it, like how you're supposed to do it, and try to avoid those things because you don't want someone out for the spring because of that. I saw Ethan Nation also. He's been around a year here, but was tweeting about getting his car stuck in the snow a few times. So everybody's having issues out there. I've mostly just stayed inside my house for 4 days, except for like one trip to the grocery store.
I'm imagining like a GA doing like the old chivalry thing, like where he has like takes his jacket off and puts it down over a patch of ice, so like Willis McGahee can walk over it. Like that's what I'm picturing from your scenario there.
You're talking about like 1940s chivalry, which would like when you were supposed to walk on the side closest to the street if you're a fella, like that was like I think one of the rules in case someone splashes mud or whatever up on. That could be a nice touch for the new guys.
Yeah. Well, speaking of guys who are adjusting to new places, Glenn Thomas. It sounds like he's going to have to do a little adjusting to a new place. Nebraska, the long rumored and I guess expected. I mean, is that fair? I mean, it probably depends for the clock to run out, but on the playoffs.
Yeah, it probably depends which circle you're in. I think to some people yesterday when it was announced, it was like, oh, Glenn Thomas, like, they're doing their research. And then there's other people who've, if you kind of live in that world for a few weeks, you've kind of been expecting this one.
So Glenn Thomas coming on board at Nebraska to coach quarterbacks, and the kind of results of that move, you have Marcus Satterfield continuing with offensive coordinator responsibilities. You have Satterfield's going to handle tight ends, and Josh Martin, who was the interim tight ends coach following the resignation of Bob Wager, is headed back to his role as an analyst, presumably to work with tight ends, or he was, I believe, brought in for special teams initially.
Yeah, he was
supposed to do. He's also coached running backs too at other spots, so maybe there's a change there if he helps there. But anyways, so Thomas in, Satterfield to tight ends and offensive coordinator. What do you kind of make of that move? And I kind of, if you get into his background a little bit, I mean, this is a guy that's very, very familiar to Matt Rhule and this staff and kind of how they do things.
Yeah, he was at Temple from 2015 to 16. Then he was at Baylor as the co-OC and QB's coach from 2017 to 19. He had a really nice run with Charlie Brewer at Baylor. And if you've listened closely to Rhule speak about his former players, there's a list of 4 or 5 guys who comes up more than others.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that to make fun. It's just like, you have guys that kind of jump to the top, and Charlie Brewer is one of those guys, just the way he handled that spot and grew into a leader for that team and sort of a clutch guy, and got him a lot of wins. And the guy who was helping coach him, Glenn Thomas, it makes sense that he would reunite with Rhule here. And I'm looking at it from Glenn Thomas's point of view. He was just with the Steelers, so a pretty good gig. There's got to be some excitement about, hey, why don't you come in here and coach this guy, Dylan Raiola, who just threw a ball 72 yards at the Polynesian Bowl. And when you watch it come out of his hand, you're like, yeah, I'll work with that. I mean, it's got to be exciting for a coach. It probably wasn't the hardest sell as it was coming together, with Dylan, and all that stuff sort of was merging at the same time, like with Dylan deciding to switch from Georgia to Nebraska, and probably this coaching decision for Glenn Thomas. But I have to think from his vantage point, he's pretty fired up about what he's walking into with not just Dylan, but also Danny, Kalen, getting his career going.
Just kind of going back to Brewer's numbers, I believe the 19 season would have been his last one with Thomas, correct?
Yes.
So he that year completed basically 65% of his passes, 21 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. Those were all improvements from 2018, numbers wise. That's not bad. You'd take that. You would have taken that last year. And I think the thing that helps too, and I don't know how you feel about this, Brian. I've heard some people say it. I don't know that I necessarily buy it, but do you feel like your OC needs to also be your quarterback's coach? Like, does that person need to be the same guy? And I say no. And I think the fact that that there's enough familiarity here with Thomas and the rest of the staff that there's not going to be kind of this power struggle or like a battle of egos, I guess, in him coming in and just handling that one room. I'm sure, he's going to have a ton of input on that offense, but I don't know that person needs to be the same guy.
No, I don't think so. More importantly, Matt Rhule obviously doesn't think so, not just by what's going on, but think about a year ago as he kind of put the map out in front of everybody right after the Iowa game about what could probably happen. When he mentioned, he's like, well, yeah, remember a year ago, sort of the initial plan was that Sat was going to be the OC and coach tight ends. In fact, Satterfield had it on his Twitter bio for about a week. That was what was going to happen. And, it seemed like Peets was going to come in maybe at that point. It was even reported, I believe, nationally that he was going to be the QB's coach probably. Sort of things got in the way of that. Didn't happen, but that shows you that in Rhule's mind, OC does not have to be the QB's coach. And I actually think with as much attention is going to be on Nebraska's quarterback room now, even more so than usual, like with Dylan Raiola's name and like how he's going to progress. I think it's kind of useful to separate the duties actually a little bit. And some of I don't want to say stress, but you know what I mean? Like everything that goes on with like wearing that as a coach, like, hey, you're in charge of this and all the scrutiny and everything that comes with it. Well, now you got it separated a bit where your OC takes some of that. The other guys working with the QBs and their minds can come together. And I think Satterfield's very accessible that way. It's the way he talks to us in the media. It seems like he's always like really valued, for instance, like Donovan Raiola's opinions within the game and like how they're working on their run stuff as the game goes on. And I'm sure that's going to be the same thing here with Glenn Thomas, and they're all familiar with one another. So this was a natural hire. It was one people, I think, who looked at it closely projected for a few weeks, and now we don't have to whisper about it anymore.
Do you think there's an advantage too of having Satterfield work with the tight ends, given kind of what that room is and what it's going to be? I mean, you've got Thomas Fedoni coming back. I think, you have some guys in that group that you feel okay about. I don't know that they necessarily, I wouldn't say that they overachieved last year at all. I mean, I think they left some stuff on the field, to be honest. I mean, I don't know how much of that was them or just, whatever the hodgepodge at quarterback was. But, you're bringing in Carter Nelson in that group in the summer. You've signed a number of other guys in that group who could stick a tight end, could be wide receivers. I mean, what is there an advantage there too to having more focus on that group from your offensive coordinator?
That's actually pretty interesting as you talk through that, because what do they talk about wanting to be all the time? A positionless offense, and there's nothing that represents that more than the tight end spot. Like Carter Nelson is like would be the face of that in some ways. Like when Rhule on signing day was speaking about, even like Walter Payton, like 4th and 1, Carter Nelson's out there, running the ball, and they're going to line him up all over the field. So if your OC's involved with that group and like, hey, we can do different things with this guy over here and that guy over there, there's probably some use to that. So, I don't think it's a big deal either way. I'm fine with it. And I think this was the initial plan they wanted to have as far as their coaching setup anyway, a year ago. And it kind of just got derailed in December. And so now you're going back to it. And it's probably, I mean, honestly, with this addition, it's a better staff to me than it was a year ago at this time. Because I think Glenn Thomas is pretty accomplished and he's done well with Rhule, and you add him in there, you feel pretty good about it. And there's the Holgerson stuff that still floats in the wind. And we said from the beginning on our site that I don't think we always thought if Holgerson ends up here, it could be more of an analyst role. That was always like our take on it, and so that remains.
And I don't get the sense that there's a lot of rush there either. Given kind of what he's coming off of, from being at Houston, and my sense is, and from talking to people, is that there's not a rush on either his part or Nebraska's to kind of, make that a shotgun marriage. I mean, I think there's mutual interest there, but you want to make sure it works. I mean, you kind of touched on it briefly. I mean, you look at what Nebraska's done this offseason from a coaching point of view. You start out right out of the gate with the Tony White stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, that feels like years ago that happened. But what do you just kind of make, I guess, overall of the changes that Matt Rhule has made to the staff? And I think some of them are some changes, but also like retaining guys. I mean, what do you kind of make of the staff as you're starting winter conditioning this week, and kind of what they made of the offseason so far in terms of addressing areas that they felt like they had to, and kind of where they came out of things?
Well, I think they've come out of it well, because like I said, on offense, I think Glenn Thomas boosts you over there. And then on defense, I mean, when the season ended, I was very worried for Nebraska's sake about, not for Tony White. It would have been awesome for him if like the head coaching thing worked out somewhere and he got that job. And I think everybody would have been happy for him. I mean, his like Q rating was through the, up in the clouds. People are so fired up about what he's done. But the fact that you get him back to run this again with a lot of returning parts really on defense. I know there's some key guys here and there we always talk about that are gone. But there's a lot of guys who know what is expected now and can teach it to some of the new guys who they want to work into the defensive system. And I just think this defense should be really good this year. I feel confident even saying that in January. And a big part of why you say that's because, Tony White's back with the same group of guys coaching with him. And I think there's some good analysts behind the scenes that Rhule believes in too. And that's the other thing about putting a staff together. And I think Rhule understands this. It's not just about your 10 assistant full-time guys. It's about how can you maximize whatever the rules are where you get as many like, useful voices in the building as you can. And that's why you look at a Holgerson, like if he wants to come here for a year or two or whatever it is and do something, before the next thing for him. That's a great thing. They have that on the defensive side of the ball. Is that Kevin McGarry? A veteran voice was there last year. And, I think all those guys are probably more important than we even know. And Rhule has talked specifically about hoping that those analyst type guys can coach even more than they've been allowed to in the past. So, whatever the rules are, you gotta make that tilted your way. And I think Rhule is always thinking about that.
I think there's a ton of value in continuity with a coaching staff. I think there's what I've been impressed by with Matt Rhule to this point is he's not attaining that kind of continuity at the expense of something being deficient. You know what I mean? Like if something is not working, he's going to make a change. And I think that's been something that's really stood out is that, he's willing to take a very fine, close look at the way things are going, make changes if he has to, but not at the, kind of bullheaded expense of like, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing because, we want to be comfortable here. And
Yeah.
I think that can sometimes be stressful for coaches. Like, I think he asks a lot of his coaches, but I think that also is kind of how you get to how you develop coaches and you kind of get more excellence out of them.
Mm-hmm. And I also think whatever everybody thinks about Satterfield's first year in Lincoln, I don't think Rhule sees it exactly like the general public. I just think he knows that the restraints they had sort of on him and the difficulties with the QB spot and trying to figure out just how to piece it together to win games sort of on that side of the ball. And I think like there was a quote he had about sometimes there's coaches like everybody on the outside thinks did a great job and there's others people think didn't. And sometimes I think the opposite, basically of that. Or I think what you would mean with that is there's even sometimes maybe a coach who we talk about like, man, what a job he's doing. And Matt Rhule actually sees it day to day. He's like, yeah, he's doing an okay job, but this guy over here is actually doing just as good a job. He's just got a more difficult circumstance he's working with in this particular season. And so that's probably a very useful approach for the head coach to have where you're not getting swept up in whatever the public commentary is on your staff. You do make hard choices when you have to, but if you really believe like this guy is giving me his best and giving these players the best that they can have, I'm going to continue with it no matter what somebody says on a podcast or whatever, so that's the way you got to be in that captain's chair.
All right. Anything else with Glenn Thomas? We can take a quick break and then you got to turn the page. We're already on 2024. Guys are coming on campus.
Yep.
And we can get into some early enrollees and then talk about one particular early enrollee who is in Hawaii right now. Very jealous of that. So we'll take a quick break and be right back in just a second. All right. Early enrollee time. We mentioned Ja'Cory Barney, his unfortunate fall on the ice. Hope he's okay. But he is one of, 16 scholarship guys who are on campus right now, going through the start of winter conditioning, plus a couple walk-ons and transfers. I mean, the group is over 20 by the time you kind of factor everybody in. You talked to, I believe, like 95% of the early enrollees in the last couple of weeks just to kind of catch up and do stories and, kind of get that last word in before they are officially Nebraska players. Those are all available at Husker247 and definitely worth a read. But as you kind of get into the off season and the run up to spring ball, and we're still a couple months away from that, but who are a couple guys that are not quarterbacks, because I think that's obviously going to have a lot of attention, but who stands out to you, or guys that like that first practice of spring where we get like our 10 minutes of stretching that we get to watch? Who are you going to be trying to find in that group to see, how's this going to look?
Get your piece of paper out right in front of you. I know you have the names, because you know how this hamster wheel, how I got to get it spinning sometimes.
Right.
So let's go through the names, and I have some thoughts as we go through them. But
right.
who, just run through the name. Who's coming? We think.
All right, Raiola, Bricks, Gradney, Barney, Kalen, Murphy, McGahee, Taylor, Pyle, Buford, Smith, Shavers, Guthrie, Flint, Tarver. These names might not even be real. I don't know. I'm just reading them.
No, they're all real.
Yeah, they're real and they're spectacular. Isaac Dickey, the walk-on fullback. He's enrolling early. And then the transfers.
Okay.
So who are the non-transfer, non-quarterback? You got a lot of guys to pick from. Who stood out to you during your conversations, and who are you like, okay, I'm curious to see what this is going to be this spring?
McGahee and Shavers interest me right away, because you're talking linebackers at a position where we know that the coaching staff felt there was a little bit of a need there, because they went and got Stephon Thompson from Syracuse as a transfer portal guy. But even with his addition, I know in talking to those guys, they see that the door is open for them, like McGahee and Shavers. And McGahee was a prospect, obviously he's got it in the genes with his dad having played in the NFL and a great Miami Hurricane player. But the thing that really stuck out to me about Willis was how focused he is on making his own path and like telling his own football story, basically. And there's a real determination to him about that. And like, he takes pride, I think, that he's on the other side of the ball. Even he loves his dad, obviously, but I get it. It's like, you don't always want to be in the headline referred to as so-and-so's son. Like, it always happens in the first few headlines when a guy's introduced to a fan base. At some point, you just want to be, oh yeah, Willis McGahee the fourth is really good, like on his own measure. And I just think he's a guy who is very productive throughout his high school career, stayed loyal to Nebraska for a lot of months when there was others kicking the tires on him. And he's at a spot where I think one of those guys, either him or Shavers or a young backer, could introduce himself to the two deep at least by the time we get to the fall. And that's a long ways away. But Shavers also really interests me. Obviously, he came on the scene late. He was a Miami Hurricanes commit for a long time. He went to the Dade Broward he played in the Dade Broward All-Star game after he signed with Nebraska and was the defensive MVP of it. And I thought that was impressive that, like, he could have been on in the next chapter in his life, but he went and balled out. And he's very fast. And, I understand why Nebraska wanted to jump on that. So you'd hope that one or two of those guys can take off, Bruntz, because they've got this Miami thing starting to go. Full well on the previous regime, Nebraska really struggled with the Florida kids and keeping them here and having success over the long haul. They could recruit them, but they couldn't get much out of them. In this case, there's a very central focus to Nebraska's recruiting efforts where it's more just Miami based in that Florida recruitment. And they've got the connections there. All those guys kind of coming up at the same time, Ja'Cory Barney being one of them. Maybe that's useful too, that they're all going through it together. So those guys really have my notice. How about you?
Yeah, no, it's a good point about the Miami thing, because Philip Simpson's been huge in terms of their recruiting efforts down there. I believe he visited Shavers like the day before he visited Nebraska, was part of that group that went in and saw him. And I think in fairness to the last staff, they were that huge group of Florida commits that they had, it was the COVID year.
Yep.
You show up in Lincoln in the middle of winter, you can't do anything normal. And I think the one smart thing that Matt Rhule and his staff have done, and you can kind of tell, get those guys on campus, get them in a group, and basically get them busy. Like, keep them doing things, because I think when you do that, you forget that it's, minus 10 outside. You forget that you're so far away from home, that the sun's not out, all that stuff. And I think you have to be really dialed in on those things to make it not feel so far away, and to keep those guys not thinking, well, what am I doing here? Because football season feels really far away right now. And I think they've done a good job so far of kind of doing those things of, like, just get in the program, get on a schedule, and making them feel part of the program. Shavers in particular is interesting, though. I mean, when you kind of have those quick recruitments where a guy visits on the last weekend, commits, signs. I mean, what was kind of his approach to that kind of quick marriage with Nebraska? Because it was only 72 hours basically from when he committed from Miami to when he was committed to Nebraska.
Yeah, his dad told me when they got in the car from the Omaha airport and began the trek to the stadium, like on that Friday or whatever, to start that weekend, they were talking to the driver. Whoever the driver was, they're gonna have to bump up his pay a little bit, because he did some good recruiting, and like they were already like convinced by this person, like Nebraska's not what everybody like just pictures it from the outside necessarily. There's more to it around here than we thought. And even before they got to the stadium and did all this stuff with coaches or whatever, he told his son, he's like, the breakup with Miami or whatever, and this change of plans is going to be the best thing that ever happened to you. And so there was an immediate identification of, like, there's real opportunity here to kind of like Willis in a different way, Willis McGahee, like chart your own path somewhere else, like, not just where in the place you've always known. And it takes a special kind of, I think, prospect or kid to like want that sometimes, to like, I want to get outside of my comfort zone and go somewhere that's completely different. But I always appreciate when it happens. It's also why I'm not as hard, Bruntz, when there's a local guy who sometimes picks somewhere else, because I'm like, we celebrate it when somebody from Miami or something does it and comes here. I understand it can happen the other way as well. And anyway, those Miami guys, I'm excited about their potential. Like Ja'Cory Barney, I think with a full runway into the season could make something happen. Now, there's a lot of guys who are redshirt or second year receivers who are thinking the same thing. But that Miami crew definitely intrigues as we have this discussion about early enrollees who could do something. And then you went through the list, like Grant Bricks. I mean, being here, I think that was a tough decision for him, whether to leave high school, in December or not, but he made the call and he's going through it. And, they've got experience in front of him on the O-line, so maybe he doesn't play right away, but I think it's going to be huge for him to have this winter conditioning in this spring in the program, just like it was for like Gunnar Gatula last year.
I left Davon Hall also off that list as well. And that kind of leads into my next question. You mentioned Barney. I know that he's a guy that over North Stadium, they feel like they really got a guy out of Florida that, they got a steal there. I think that's the feeling. But that wide receiver group, I think, is of the early enrollees besides quarterbacks, maybe linebackers. I mean, the wide receiver group is going to get a lot of attention regardless. You've got Hall, you've got Barney, you've got Keelan Smith as part of that group as well. I mean, at least one of those guys is probably going to have to, get close to 4 games, I think, right? I mean, you got Jamal Banks, you got Isaiah Nair, that helps a ton. You got Coleman, Doss, Lloyd coming back from last year, Bullock. You'd probably like at least one of those young guys to emerge. Demetrius Bell, I guess, coming off of his red shirt too. We've heard nothing but good things about him and how he kind of terrorized the the defense on the scout team. But one of those guys I think has a chance or is going to have to.
Yeah, this is what I hope with receivers. It feels like every time this year in the offseason, you can go through the names and you're able to talk yourself pretty quickly into like, actually, they should be pretty good. Like you kind of can, and you can definitely do that with the guys you named off, where you're like, man, they could have 7 or 8 guys you feel okay about by the time they get to August. But let's see it. Like that's one where it's like, let's see it now, because I feel like we've been on this road before where we've been hopeful that that's going to be the picture. And then you get to the season and there's a game where it feels like who's the third receiver right now? You don't know exactly like how they're going to go beyond 4 or 5 guys. So yeah, I hoped at least one of those young guys jumps into the mix, because I think if one of those guys does it, one of the newbies, along with like say a Demetrius Bell and Coleman and Lloyd take a natural progression this year, you are feeling good then about what is the reality of it. So Keelan Smith, I'm glad you brought him up again, because I don't think anybody in this class had a better senior year than him. I mean, basically the player of the year in the state of Missouri. I'll be honest, when he committed, it was a legacy. So you're kind of fired up about that, but that was sort of where it stopped and started for me. And then you see his senior season, you're like, no, he can play, and it shows you something too. I always think, Bruntz, when a guy commits and then he goes out and backs it up that next season, it's not just like, okay, I'm kind of waiting till college or whatever. He was the best dude in the state of Missouri, and there's a lot of good players down there. So I'm really excited about him, and he's another who could be a positionless, receiver, tight end, hybrid, whatever. So yeah, he should be definitely a guy that's carries as much intrigue, I think, as like, I'll even say as like Carter Nelson and stuff. Like when he gets here, I just think Keelan Smith is a guy you should be pretty fired up about from what he did his senior year.
Yeah, Donovan Jones is the other guy that I go to of like, okay, he committed early. You were kind of like, okay, they see something in him, and then senior year, like, okay, I get it now. Like he was the other guy that definitely was not resting on his laurels after committing to Nebraska.
Yeah, Donovan, I talked to him too. He's not an early enrollee, I don't think, right?
No.
But I did do a story on him a couple weeks ago, and he can do everything in the defense. Like I think, like in that back 2 levels, like he has that potential, and he's gonna be a good player, I think.
Yeah,
and he's a North Viking.
That doesn't hurt. The other 2 guys, just to mention really quickly before we move on to one last thing, Grant Bricks and Gibson Pyle were both at the All-American Bowl in San Antonio last week, 2 weeks ago now. And I think those are 2 guys long-term that are going to benefit a ton from being on campus early. I mean, the extra semester of winter conditioning, going through that process, like you said, I don't think that either of them necessarily end up on the field this year for Nebraska. I think with Pyle, there might have been a chance, but I think, Mazuka getting in there as a transfer, I think that probably buys those guys a ton of time to develop and whatnot. But I think those 2 guys long term, I think are really nice additions. Like they had a pretty steady week down in San Antonio, and that's always I think tough as a lineman to do that. But I think they both showed that they can be certainly serviceable as run blockers. Bricks needs to add the pass protection piece of it, which a lot of high school linemen do. But anytime you can get linemen in and have that extra semester, I think it's a really big deal.
Yeah, for sure. And one of Bricks' roommate, at least as a couple of weeks ago when I did the interview, is Daniel Kalen. And I'll just say a quick word about him. Obviously, I think a lot of Husker fans really appreciate that he stuck with the class. But you talk to Michael Huffman, the Bellevue West coach, and he made a really good point. He's like, when he was talking with Danny about the situation, he's like, that's a great opportunity. I mean, truly it is. Like, there's actually only 3 scholarship QBs in the room right now. Like, he could have went and visited Michigan State or whatever, but they plucked another guy that they love to be their quarterback. And it would have been that way anywhere you go. And so the fact that he gets to come in at the same time, and Raiola is going to get up more of the steam and more headlines and all that, but you watch this for a long time, Bruntz. You got to have multiple guys ready at that spot. And there's not a lot of people in the chairs right now. So it's a pretty good deal for him to like just go compete his butt off and just see where it takes him. And let the noise go elsewhere, but maybe you quietly position yourself to matter sooner than later in some way, because usually you do need multiple QBs within a season.
Yeah. Well, and it's, you always you have that identifier with Dylan Raiola right now as, 5-star quarterback Dylan Raiola. People need to remember that Danny Kaelin was also an Elite 11 quarterback, and was among the top 11 according to a lot of people at that, watching that competition, and part of it, he won the accuracy competition, so he's no slouch. As much excitement as there is about Dylan Raiola, and we'll talk about him here in a minute, Daniel Kaelin is a very good quarterback in his own right, just to say.
Yep. And dudes like him a lot in that class. He was a vocal leader for that class, and I think Raiola is becoming that now too, now that he's back in the fold. But yeah, that'll be fun to watch those two grow. But yes, we do talk probably more, and we're going to about Raiola, who's down at the Polynesian Bowl. He's like Uncle Rico, and not his throwing motion, but he can throw it over those mountains. Maybe it kind of looked like it when he launched his 72-yard pass, like it could go over the tops of the peaks there.
Yeah. So let's talk about that briefly. So the last big showcase event is the Polynesian Bowl. That'll be broadcast Friday night at 8:00, I believe, Central Time, on the NFL Network. Dylan Raiola, Carter Nelson's playing in it as well, and Preston Tauma, the offensive line signee out of Hawaii. But Dylan Raiola, first day of practice, they do a long throw competition. He's the only quarterback that throws it 70 yards, and his 2 throws went 72 and 70 yards, which was notable. Won the competition. And you've seen the clips, you've seen the interviews with the guys from 24/7, Blair Angula, Greg Biggins, and Brandon Huffman. The ball looks good coming out of his hand, like it really does. And you were at that camp with me the first time he showed up and threw in Memorial Stadium, and you're like, okay, this looks right. It still looks right. It still looks right.
Yeah. You know what? And a few weeks ago, when we were waiting to see how the dust settled with Nebraska's quarterback situation, I was among those who was pretty fired up about like having that veteran guy who's that bridge into the future when the whole McCord thing was in play, maybe, whatever. I've moved on from it pretty fast, and maybe that's just what you do when it goes a certain way. We're used to that, like, oh, we got to go this way now, so we'll do that dutifully. But it hasn't been hard to get like on board with like that. Yes, he's a 18-year-old freshman, but man, he does have tools that we haven't seen from guys at that position around here. That doesn't mean it's all going to be roses the first year. There's going to be lumps. Everybody knows that. But he can do all the throws, and you hear that about a lot of guys, but it does look different. And here's what stands out to me is last week, Jamal Banks commits. You're talking about a 22, 23-year-old guy from Wake Forest who's been around college football 4 or 5 years. And he went out of his way to talk about how when he threw with Raiola on his visit, he's like, yeah, he's like beyond a lot of those guys who have been around a lot, just like with everything he does. He was talking about like the depth he gets, like just in his footwork when he goes back to throw. Like it all stood out to Banks as like, this guy's really pretty polished for his age. And, has obviously had good teaching at the position. So yeah, there's a lot of hype around him, and that's not going to go away. It's going to be one of the most hype players we've ever covered at the University of Nebraska, but there's a reason for it. He's got a skill set that is special. Now you just hope it can all come together, but it's got to excite Husker fans. They've had players at all-star games like this before, but it's never been like this that I remember, with a guy where like it's check-in day on Sunday and like it's who's on the all lobby team. And it's like, the first paragraphs in from our national guys is Dylan Raiola. Like he's the guy everybody wants to talk about, and not just around here. And that's exciting to have that.
Yeah, the most recent write-up, they were talking about just kind of the media demands that he's had there.
Yeah.
And I think, he's handled it pretty well, all things considered. I mean, he did some interviews during his recruiting process, but I think now that he's signed and is out there a little bit more, I mean, the demands are high. That's not going to change when he's at Nebraska either, for sure. But I think he's handled all that really well. So good practice, I guess, in Hawaii for what he's going to face in Lincoln. I'll be eager to see how Matt Rhule kind of handles the quarterback discussions this spring. I don't know. I don't think we're going to have a situation where you've got a veteran quarterback talking about the two younger quarterbacks and that's it. We've done that before in Nebraska. And, I do think it is important, though, to manage that as best you can,
right,
from a coaching perspective.
Yeah, it won't be easy. The thing that's good about this event is people are seeing Dylan do some interviews, and he's very capable of it, as he's shown. And I mean this as a compliment. Like, I think when you're going through the recruiting process and you're that high profile, you do have to sometimes distance yourself, like, from it, like always being out front. And so sometimes, because of that, I think Dominic would kind of speak in some of the interviews and stuff like that. And people might form an idea like, oh, okay, Dylan can't talk for himself. Well, he's pretty good at it, I think. Like, so that's something about this event that's good. And I understand the way they handle the process, but now, like, as he's talking about wanting to be a transformational leader, and that's something he wrote down after he had that talk with Rhule, like, that's what I want to be. And he knows it starts now. Like, it's got to start at this event where you're with your future teammates, like Carter Nelson, and you're trying to form a chemistry there in passes and practices. It's going to matter when he comes back and you're pushing a prowler in the snow, in the stadium. Like, you've got to be the guy who's like at the front of the line, and you just show everybody, sort of like you showed Jamal Banks a week or so ago. Yeah, like, it's legit. Like, everything he wants to put in the work to be great, and not just have it be about, I was a big time recruit and the story ends there. So these are a big few weeks, for him and Daniel, when he gets going, to establish with their teammates that, yeah, they're young quarterbacks, but you can get behind me, and because I'm going to work as hard as you.
You'll get to see Dylan Raiola again Friday, 8 p.m. I believe, 8:30. I think 8.
That's too early for you. Like, you probably wish that were a little later.
Yeah, well, if they were kicking it off like a Hawaii game, I mean, we'd be watching this thing at midnight, which would be okay with me. But yeah, NFL Network will be broadcasting that. Our guys from 24/7 will have ample coverage of that game, and much more from the Polynesian Bowl. And then we're on to the offseason, the workouts in 2024. So that's all I've got. Is that all you got?
Yeah, I think we covered enough ground for a cold January day. We try to do our part to give some people something to listen to while they're shoveling. Do people listen to these podcasts while they're like shoveling snow or anything, or are you just like focused on surviving more? I think
I
probably
think it's more survival. It's not as enjoying.
it's not like mowing the lawn.
No, it's not. All right. So Brian Christopherson there. I'm Michael Bruntz. Get to Husker 24/7 this week. Lots of Polynesian Bowl coverage. All of Brian's rundowns with early enrollees on the site. Again, worth a read. Maybe 2 reads if you really want to. We'll be back with podcasts later in the week. And thanks for listening.